Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So for the next little bit, we're going to be talking about both of these books, but mostly Rich's Revolution in Higher Education book, and kind of talking about the landscape of higher education. Rich, you talk about having a revolution. I guess the question is, how much of a revolution do we need in higher ed? If on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you put the current state of higher ed? 10 being it's the best in the world and nothing has to change, and 1, the entire system has to be blown up.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a story of contradictions. On the one hand, if you look at anyone's ranking of world universities, American universities dominate. 60% of the schools in the THE list of world universities are North American. It's the most copied model in the world. The problem is that those excellent institutions educate less than 20% of the people that go to college. And so if you step back from that nice picture and look at higher education as a system, there are these real islands of excellence, but the experience for most college students really isn't excellent at all. So we have these two worlds, and that's kind of what's driving the interest on the part of the innovators that I talk about in this book at fixing some fundamental issues with higher education. So the question isn't so much why do we need a revolution. I think we're sitting in the front seat of a car that's careening out of control. It's heading in a different direction than anyone thought, and I wanted to get that across to the readers by focusing on the agendas of the people that are trying to make change. I mean, one way you can do a book like this is to kind of summarize, what's wrong and call for change. As I talked to people doing the research for this book, I really thought that there was a barrier towards making predictions. People just sort of didn't resonate with the idea of, well, why should things turn out that way? So I called 60 of my closest friends who I knew were trying to make change. So what are you trying to do? And that, I think, was a way of getting over this hurdle of avoiding being a fortune teller. Mm-hmm. If these people are successful, whether it's online delivery of courses or new business models or reconstructing the social contract that universities have, if this group of people is successful, then the world will be fundamentally changed.
So you talked about islands of excellence. Does that mean that everyone who's not on those islands is sinking? Are we going to see a number of universities, as some predict, including Clay Christensen at Harvard Business School, go out of business in the next 10 years?
Yeah, if not go out of business, fundamentally change their business. I just saw an interview this morning with Andy Card, president of Franklin Pierce University. So a well-regarded university, an old university. The president is a former chief of staff for a president of the United States. You would assume he understands the mechanics of running large organizations. They have slashed their undergraduate programs by almost 50%. So the contract that they had with freshmen coming into Franklin Pierce has been fundamentally broken. And there is just story after story of institutions either selling themselves wholesale to for-profit providers of education, or contracting to the point where they become different institutions than what they were supposed to be, what their alumni, what their stakeholders, what their trustees imagine.
So are we just going to see kind of a growing divide in American higher education? Because obviously at the top, the most elite, most selective universities are more popular than ever before. I mean, more people want to get into them around the world than ever before. And at the bottom, or even in the mid-tier, you have people, in fact, today there's a list of schools that are still looking for people to fill their seats in the fall, right? So right. Is it just kind of a tale of two very different higher education systems?
It's a tale of inequality. You notice that Andrew Young wrote the foreword for my book, and one of the reasons that Andy was attracted to this story was that as a civil rights leader, he's had to contend with inequality across the spectrum, and he looks at inequality in education as one of the great evils of modern society. Yeah, it's absolutely true. If you're a single parent trying to get an associate's degree in a large metropolitan area, your chances of success along that path are nothing like the freshman who enters Georgia Tech, who enters UW, who enters Stanford or Harvard, where the pathway ahead is pretty much guaranteed, and that divide is only getting bigger.
Well, there's another divide. You mentioned UW, you mentioned Georgia Tech, both public institutions. We've seen, you talk about the rankings in both of your books, but we've seen among the U.S. News and World Report rankings in particular, privates, all the changes in the top 25 have all been publics falling off and privates going up. So is there a particular sector as we think about the future that you really worry about? And I preface this question by saying, should we be worried about some of the great public universities in this country?
Yeah,
including one right here.
I think so. I think if you look at the issues that University of Washington is contending with, the issues of capacity and cost and access and continuing high quality education for the students who are increasingly unfunded to attend here. So the capping of enrollments in computer science, for example, is one of the symptoms of what happens when these systems hit their capacity. Before we started, you were mentioning your visit to University of California, and the sense at UC Berkeley that they are going to make up their losses in volume. That they're going to maybe you can tell the story about how it looks from the point of view of an elite university.
Yeah, I mean, so I was down in Los Angeles earlier this week, where I was with a couple of presidents of the UC system, including San Diego and Berkeley and UCLA, all of which have taken pretty major cuts from the state. And how have they made up those cuts? They have increased their enrollment of out-of-state and out-of-country students. So they're taking more international students. They're taking more out-of-state students who pay higher prices, and especially international students don't come with any financial aid, so it's a real big boom in terms of dollars. At the same time, California's population is exploding, continues to explode. Most of the students who are coming down the pike are from underrepresented groups that higher education has largely done a terrible job serving, and they come from first generation and students who are going to have a hard time affording college. And it was kind of an interesting dynamic, because you had them talking about how hard it is to get into the University of California, how they're going far and wide now to recruit students. At the same time, they're a public university set up by the citizens and taxpayers of California, and there's all these students in the system today, don't even mention what's coming down the pike, who can't get in. And it just didn't, it makes me wonder, and maybe you could talk about this in Georgia, it just makes me wonder, you kind of struck this bargain with the citizens of Georgia X number of years ago. Is the feeling on campus, well, they haven't held up their end of the bargain by giving us money, so we're not going to hold our end of the bargain?
Surprisingly not. I hear that a lot when I visit other campuses. There's surprisingly little of that at Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech has been very successful at building endowments, and as much as we complain about the budget pressures, the truth of the matter is we really haven't gone through the same kinds of problems that other institutions have. I think that the things that concern me, I want to come back to this issue of the social contract, because you talk about it in your book too. The things that concern me are more the more visible parts of what I think is broken in higher education. So because Georgia Tech has become more popular, our application pool is increasing. It's increasing in quality. Our capacity hasn't increased. And so we find ourselves now accepting 20% or less of the students that enroll.
So let me ask you about this capacity thing. You can't increase capacity because you have so many beds, so many seats, right? But yet, we've been talking about the technology revolution in higher ed now for 20 plus years. We've heard a lot about technology in the classroom particularly, and I want to talk about the last 5 years between your books in a couple of minutes. Why have all of these changes in teaching methods, hybrid classes, online classes, flipping the classroom, all that stuff, why doesn't that allow institutions to increase capacity?
So I see a T-shirt for the online master's degree in computer science from Georgia Tech. So this one program increased the capacity of Georgia Tech by 10% without increasing costs at all.
That's amazing.
And it is all through a combination of doing what we do best, which is excellent pedagogy in computer science, and the productivity increases that you get from doing the courses well online. That's a pathway. I mean,
So why don't more, in your mind, as you've interviewed these innovators, why in your mind haven't more universities adopted something, not exactly like that, but have not channeled more technology to help them increase capacity at a lower cost?
Yeah,
or same cost?
so a few reasons. One is that professors are pretty good at reading the tea leaves, and if you continue to increase the productivity of individual professors and the number of students is constant or going down, sooner or later you're going to need fewer professors, and people have noticed that. I think the honest answer is that the governance has not been terrific at most universities, and particularly at most large public universities. So making the kinds of decisions that we made at Tech, which is to try this out. Let's put the Georgia Tech brand behind the highest quality degree that we can offer to our traditional students, and do it in this new format.
But that was kind of a big risk, right? Because online education is still seen as, by some, if you look at the surveys, as second rate, right? That was a big risk for you guys to do that.
We had to put our brand at risk, and the deal was that it had to be a real prototype. We couldn't treat this as kind of a funny one-off degree. The degree that you get when you get the online master's in CS is indistinguishable from the traditional master's degree. And so we were willing to stand behind that. The university system was willing to stand behind that. Without having alignment from faculty to chancellor, that's impossible to get. So this is what I mean by governance being broken. You need to have that kind of alignment focused on goals, rather than thinking about how to expand your out-of-state students to increase your revenue base. Much better to think about inventive ways for dealing with the people that you're supposed to educate.
So I want to go back in time a little bit. It's 2016, so let's go back to when you were writing your first book, launching the center. I was at the birth of the center.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Actually, it was the first time I really heard much about MOOCs. You guys spent a lot of time on MOOCs that day. So as we look back on the 5 years, everybody always talks about how slow higher education is to change. But as you look back on these last 5 years between these books, has it changed a lot more in the last 5 years than it has in the last 15, 20?
It's been remarkable. I
mean, in what ways has it changed?
So I take this word revolution as kind of a literary device for describing what's going on, but it really has been a set of revolutionary changes. I had a hard time in 2008 when I started writing Abelard. I had a hard time finding a university president who was willing to back the idea of online education in any aspect of their curriculum. And if they were going to do it, they were going to offer it as a low-cost, high-tuition way of offloading students that they didn't want to service. I couldn't find faculty that were behind it. I couldn't find people that weren't willing to say, gee, there might be something wrong with the long lecture format. We've been doing this for 800 years and it hasn't worked out particularly well for us. Doing this book, which was 4 years later, 5 years later, I had a hard time finding anyone at any level in public and private universities that was willing to back the idea of the long-form lecture as a standard mode of delivery. Now that sounds like a small thing, but you have to remember that we put tens of millions of dollars into building these theaters that are really ways for professors to give sermons to large groups of people. So that idea, I think, has largely been discarded as a way of.
That's a big change.
It's a huge change, and And some of this, I think, turns out to be just pointing out the obvious inconsistencies with that as a mode of delivery. For everything that we know about neuroscience, everything that we know about cognitive science, if you had to design a way of delivering educational content that was guaranteed to drive off students who needed to learn, the long-form lecture is what you would invent. You would take 18-year-old people, you would put them in chairs like this, bring the house lights down, and have someone who's not particularly skilled at public speaking drone at them for 50 minutes. Right. Every once in a while, maybe if you're lucky, give them a test to figure out whether or not they learn.
Well, and as I always said in those large lecture halls, that was the original distance education, where those people in the back, right?
Yeah.
No, that's pretty far away out there. Okay, so 5 years ago, a lot has changed in the last 5 years. Let's now look ahead.
Yep.
Next 5 years. As you think about the seismic changes that are happening in higher ed, where do you think the most effort's going to be? We talked a lot about data analytics in the last couple of years. We've talked a lot about unbundling the degree. We've talked a lot about stackable credentials. If we were here 5 years from now, and I asked you this question about the last 5 years, what would you be talking about?
So I think a few things come to mind. One or two of the things that you mentioned are certainly high on my list. So the idea that we're now to the point where the models that we can develop of what a student is likely to do in the future based on data that we've gathered in the past is getting very good. And you can think about personalized education that delivers the right content to the students in a way that they can digest it. Some of this has to do, well, I mean, in your book, you talk about the transition from thinking of college as a way to get a license to go out and have a good life to something else, and we're not quite sure what that something else is. That notion of value, I think, is going to seep into higher education and fundamentally change the structures, the institutions.
Oh, no doubt about it. In fact, I think it's already starting to do that. It used to be that it was kind of almost blind faith, right? You would go to college to get a degree, and largely, I graduated 20 years ago, and when I graduated, you had that degree. It was a golden ticket in the job market, and that it was a signal, right? And it largely still is a signal, but I think it has a lot more noise around it now. Employers, the employers I interview in my book, trust it as a symbol of discipline. Somebody started something and they finished it. Great, check mark. But they don't see largely embedded in it anymore the soft skills that they want, right? The ability to work in teams and problem solving and all the things that people used to think, and maybe they weren't, maybe we just now call them out more often. People used to think were embedded in the bachelor's degree. They're not doing that anymore. And so how is that changing higher education and the workforce? Well, now we see companies asking for soft skills in job ads. Much more today than they ever had before. There was this analysis that Burning Glass did, which analyzes job ads. They scraped 20 million online job ads last year. 4 out of 5 of them had the same top 25 skills listed. And the top 4 skills were all soft. There was only one hard skill, Microsoft Excel. If you know Excel, you're golden. But all the other ones were, problem solving, team building, all the soft skills that they don't believe kids come out of college with anymore. So now parents, as they think about, it's not that, I'll send my kid anywhere at any price, which I think up until about 5-6 years ago, people just said, higher education is worth it no matter what, because they were looking at those average income over your lifetime. Now they're starting to say, where you go, how, and more important, how you go, what you do in that time in college. So I think this whole idea of value is going to become much more important in the next 5 years.
The trick is to get a generation of college leaders to buy into that concept.
Yeah, right, because most college leaders think, again, they think that higher education should not be treated as a commodity.
How many presidents imagine that shrinking the size of their intercollegiate athletics program is the pathway to the next presidency? It goes in the opposite direction. You want to grow. You want to show unbridled growth. You want to show lots of donors excited about what you're doing. And the other measures, which, to be honest, are harder to get at, become less important.
Well, in some ways, it's so, you talk a lot about the rankings in your book, and, the rankings have really, in my opinion, have set off this race, this arms race in higher education, to have more buildings, more academic programs, more athletics, more recreational programs, the best dorms, the best food service, more, right? Because everybody wanted to move up in those rankings. Well, now, first of all, it's almost impossible anyway, right? Everybody who's tried it, almost impossible. And those rankings tell us very little about the outputs of those universities. So if we start thinking about the outputs, which I think data analytics and other stuff will start telling us about it, I think this could fundamentally change how we view colleges and universities, that we'll start picking the places that have the best outcomes rather than the best inputs, which is really what USC is world.
So I saw this. There's a chapter in my book on historically black colleges. I noticed that in all the books out on what's happening in higher education, almost no one wrote about HBCUs. So I went to Jackson State University, which was under severe pressure 4 years ago with falling enrollments, declining state budgets, all the ills that you see in public universities kind of come to roost in historically black colleges. And one of the things that was going on was that they had a generation of leaders that were chasing Ole Miss and Mississippi State. So you take kids from local high schools and you stack them up against a big football school like Ole Miss versus Jackson State, which is a much more academic kind of place, and the kids were immediately drawn to the big time football schools. And Carolyn Myers, who's the president, decided that she didn't want to compete on that basis anymore. She didn't want to compete on completion rates. She didn't want to compete on measures that kind of skew things against an institution like that. So they tore out the first floor of their library and put in a set of technologies that are specifically aimed at active learning. So a kid who comes in to Jackson State may not come in with the kind of critical reading skills, critical writing skills that they need, but clever using the technology, they build that up, and they build it up in a way that makes sense for a black kid who's coming into college. Sociology course treats those parts of sociology that are often not dealt with well elsewhere. And then they went out and recruited the largest freshman class that they could. They made the deans financially responsible. They tied compensation to recruiting the right kind of class. So they curated a freshman class the same way Harvard or Princeton would curate a freshman class. Ended up with the largest freshman class in history, against all scales, the most talented freshman class. And they promised them 4 years of support. And that started them on a very different path. But Carolyn had to kind of abandon the idea that Jackson State would be measured against the measures that would matter for a public research university. I think they're better off. They think they're on a sustainable path. The question is, how do you do that? How do you get that fundamental value redefinition into an institution?
Well, so she's part of, I noticed you call name a small band of innovators. How small? And who are they? Talk a little bit about who are these innovators? Is there anything that ties them together, or are they all over the place at all different types of institutions?
Well, I think to some extent it's a shared sense of social mission. If you want to cut through all the differences, and the people I'm talking about range from the Daphne Kohlers and Sebastian Thruns of the world to people that you've never heard about before, like Carolyn Myers. What underlies everything that they're doing is a strong moral commitment to universities being important to the fabric of American life. So kind of disregarding the front page headlines that you hear about these places, there is a commitment. And the commitment is to the things that I talk about: affordability, accessibility, doing it at a way that actually improves the achievement level of students. So if you think about what Paul LeBlanc has done at Southern New Hampshire, he's isolated a group of students that were not being well served by the top 20%, probably not being served at all, and he structured a program that is useful to those students at the point they're at in their lives, and it wasn't going to be served otherwise. And there's just story after story of how this happens. I mean, the stories are really kind of interesting. I go back to Michael Crow a lot, both in Abelard in this book, and one of the things that
and Michael Crow, for those who don't know, is president of Arizona State University,
and a good friend of both of us. And one of the things that you notice if you engage Michael Crow for 5 seconds is that he kind of believes in his gut that he has a responsibility to reach into every household in the state of Arizona and provide something to the citizens of that state. That used to be the standard idea.
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I mean, he believes in the publicness of public universities.
Right. And so, you know, my small band is probably a few hundred people, which is small.
Thankfully, it's not a dozen, right?
Yeah, it's not a dozen. And you know, as I go to universities and talk to people that are thinking deeply about these problems, I realize that we are in the early stages of this revolution. That there are people who have taken this to heart and are internalizing.
So, but what are the hurdles to this change? You're pretty tough in the book on things like tenure and shared governance and all the trappings of of colleges and universities. Does that mean that those things have to go away in order to fundamentally change higher education, or we've tried to reform them many times over the years, including accreditation as well.
Right.
And we haven't really done a good job at any of them. So what are the hurdles to having more than just a couple hundred innovators and having thousands of them?
So incentives, clearly. If you want to rise in the ranks of leadership in a university, the easiest way to do it is to imitate the people that are above you. So we've set up an incentive structure that rewards presidents for making their institutions look like the institutions that are ranked above them. Accreditation is a huge hurdle. It's sort of interesting that we've set up an accreditation regime in this country that can't distinguish between a university that graduates 0% of its students, of its freshmen, and one that graduates 100%. They all get accredited.
Right.
It's very hard to find an institution that is put on probation or loses its accreditation because it's doing a bad job educationally. It's easy to find places that lose their accreditation because their football coach is on the take or someone has embezzled money.
But not when it comes to what the university is supposed to be all about, the teaching and learning.
Yeah.
It's much harder.
Right, and you're seeing that regime crack. I think what Paul LeBlanc did by getting competency-based education under Title IV of the Education Act, so need-based funding for students that are going through Southern New Hampshire College for America, is a big step forward. The institutions, I focus on tenure not because I don't like tenure. I just see tenure disappearing before my eyes. We already have half of the college faculty not on tenure track. So the minority of faculty members in American universities are not going to ever get tenure because they're not tenure track appointments. And it becomes less and less significant because market forces tend to take over. It kind of begs the question, so how do you guarantee academic freedom? And that is a significant issue. But these issues that have become institutionalized in higher education that have been barriers to progress, I think, are disappearing. And then governance. I mean, I have this last chapter in the book where I talk about the most horrific horror stories you can imagine that are due to ill-informed or malicious governance on the part of boards of trustees and presidents. That turns out to be something that's very hard to get your head wrapped around, and probably not helped by the technology. So a lot of the book talks about the promise of technology. This is an area where social media has broken down. I call it the age of internet empires. So it has broken down traditional boundaries between institutions and said it's very easy to mount a campaign to keep a commencement speaker out of a university. So why would you do that? Why would you not include alternative voices in your institution.
Right.
And these are the kinds of breakdowns in governance that I think it's hard to see how we move forward without fundamental changes.
So we've talked a lot about institutions, but I actually outline in my book about a growing new learning economy that operates outside of traditional higher education. I talk about this idea that we've moved from the rhetoric to reality around lifelong education, that this idea that you go to college or university one time in your life, usually early in your life, and then you're done, is over. Obviously, people have always gotten professional education, but as we move more to a gig economy, where are you going to get that from, right? You're not a full-time employee. You're not necessarily part of an association that tells you what you need and when you need it. So where are you going to get that from? You're going to get that from this new learning economy that's growing up, the likes of which are the coding academies and the MOOC providers, places like lynda.com and others where you could get just-in-time education at a time. What do you think about all these other new players in higher education, all of whom operate outside of the accreditation system? None of them are accredited. All of whom have unbundled the traditional higher education thing. They focus on one thing and one thing only, and they know exactly what they want to do. There's going to be no football teams at edX, and know exactly who their market is. Do you think that this is the wave of the future? Do you think that more of these entities will start to rise up? Or do you think universities will say, hey, wait a second, they're taking a piece of our business?
So let me ask you that question. I mean, you talk about the future of bachelor's degrees. I mean, do you see bachelor's degrees as disappearing?
I do not see bachelor's degrees disappearing. Where I think this is going to have a huge disruptive effect is in professional master's and certificate programs. Because for the most part, those programs are what I would call fat, right? They require students to dedicate too much time, effort, and money. And they give them way more than they need at the point in life that they need it, right? I mean, the one thing I like about the boot camps is that they follow the model of the military boot camp, right? They give you just enough to get the job, just like in the military. They get you just enough to go into combat, but you're always going to add on to that over time. Where the professional master's degrees and especially certificate programs, they give you, 18 months or 2 years. They give you a multitude of courses and they're very expensive. And really all you need to get going is that slice of it. Now, you're going to need those other slices eventually, but you might need them 5, 10 years down the road when, by the way, they're going to be more useful because the economy and the job market is changing so much, you're going to actually need additional training.
So how about
anyway.
embracing those? Wouldn't traditional institutions want to embrace that?
I would think that they would want to embrace them, but graduate professional programs and certificate programs are cash cows for colleges and universities. They provide a lot of revenue that then goes and subsidizes other things at the college and university. And I think this is one of the biggest hurdles to change is the way we financially operate our colleges and universities. I think when I talk to people at colleges and universities, there's a lot of ideas they actually like, but it always comes, or are good pedagogically, right? They say, oh yeah, it's much better to teach us, freshmen. We shouldn't be putting freshmen in classrooms of 300 students with a graduate student teaching them or an adjunct. They should be in small seminars, but we can't do that because we need those large lectures to subsidize everybody else. So it always comes down to great idea, but we can't do it for financial reasons.
So I've got a colleague who's always been suspicious of scale. So suspicious of anything that scales up the small classroom experience. And we had an amazing discussion just a few weeks ago. He said, I've always felt that the small class experience was a superior way to learn. It was a superior experience for students. It didn't occur to me until I read your book that it's only superior if you're one of the students in that small class. And you know what? There's not enough money to have enough small classes to make it good. So you have, it's back to this inequality issue, you have a small number of people in what is arguably a superior educational experience at the expense of a large group of people that are sitting in football stadiums, getting lectures from a distant figure.
Well, and again, if we see these graduate, professional, and certificate programs start to disappear and go away, and we're already seeing graduate enrollment among American students go down. The only thing that's keeping graduate enrollment consistent
MBAs
overall.
MBAs in particular
MBAs
are hurting
I
for
was
American
just
students.
I was just at Notre Dame 2 weeks ago, and their MBA program is cratered. Their enrollments have dropped so drastically, and now they're stuck with all these high-priced faculty members that they've made promises to, many of them are tenured, and now what do they do? So they're trying to figure out, we have to create new programs, new business programs that are not an MBA. And we see that also with law schools. And I think on the professional, I have a journalism undergrad. There's all these journalism schools out there. There's no reason you need a journalism master's degree. No reason at all. But, one after another created journalism and public affairs and public relations and public administration. I mean, there is just a multitude of these programs out there that are going to be impossible to.
All because the Columbia Journalism School, which is a graduate school, is the one that you want to be like. Yeah.
Yeah. They wanted to emulate it. So let's look for. Do you want to take some questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Before we move on.
Yes. I can't see the back of the room. But
So I have a question that's somewhat related, and there's two parts to it. One part is, why is it so expensive for like this next generation, the people in grade school and high school today? They're facing extreme costs of getting a college education. And on the other hand, where has that expense actually gone to the university? I used to think maybe it was within the department. Now some of the things you're suggesting means it's not even increased salaries or expectations of professors, but other things. So maybe you can share on both those.
So I devote a whole chapter to this in the book, trying to lay out the economic arguments in a digestible form. The answer seems to be in two pieces. One is about a third of the cost increases are due to unrealized gains in productivity. So we're one of the few industries where technology has not resulted in productivity.
Still takes one professor to teach 20 students
50
today.
minutes.
Just
A 50-minute lecture takes 50 minutes no matter what you do. And the macroeconomic effects of that kind of ripple through higher education. If you just look at that one aspect of cost, it's a huge driver. The other piece is there's almost no investment. Imagine if Microsoft decided to not invest any of its revenue in the next generation of products and improving. Well, higher education has been doing this for 200 years. We've had about $500 billion in cost increases since 1985. Take higher education in total. There has been no indication that $500 billion has been used to improve our products. And in fact, it's gone the other direction. So that we've gone through $500 billion of cost increases. Completion rates have gone down. Success rates have gone down. Any measure that you want to choose, it's been a less successful enterprise, and that's a governance issue. That really has to do with the fact that every board of trustees, every university president is presented with a seemingly unending stream of good ideas, and they just
take them all.
Yeah, they take them all. And if there was a modicum of attention being paid to why don't we look for those ideas that actually improve the product that we're building, we might have seen a different outcome. But we don't do that. So each of these investments that are made are designed to bring in more revenue, and the revenue never keeps up with the costs of running those programs. So you get an increasing cost. Well, it's called revenue caps cost. So revenue cap cost says that you're going to bring in as much money as you can and spend it all this year.
And there's no relationship in many ways between cost and price, right? So even if you can figure out a cheaper way to offer something, you're not going to reduce the price of it.
Well, so we did this.
There's no incentive.
We did this with OMSCS, and it was really one of the business breakthroughs that we had to do. The original idea was we would take the Georgia Tech tuition and discount it by some level, and we couldn't figure out how to discount it. So we had the idea of starting with a blank sheet of paper, and building up the actual cost of offering the program online. And of course, every time we didn't put a traditional cost, so why aren't you putting nurses' fees in your well, it's because these students aren't going to make use of the infirmary. We don't need to charge them. They're not going to come to football games. We don't need to charge them the athletic fee. And so when you do that, the cost of offering the OMSCS came in somewhere around $5,000, and we weren't quite sure exactly what the cost would be, so we added a contingent on top of that, and the number turned out to be about $6,700. And that's what we offered it for.
Amazing difference.
And you know, the fact that we could do it in a very conservative university system with a very conservative administration and still do it in a financially responsible way, I think speaks volumes of what can be done.
It reminds me of, you mentioned Paul LeBlanc, who's the chancellor of Southern, or president of Southern New Hampshire University, and they started a competency-based program, meaning your degree is based on what you know rather than how much time you spend in a seat. But when they were building that, and I went to visit him, he wanted to charge $5,000 or less for that program. And he put that number up on a whiteboard, and everything they did was aimed at hitting that number or below it, right? So anything that they added that cost more than that, they took it away, which is exactly the opposite about how everything else is designed in higher ed. You just design it, and then you say, okay, what's the price of this? That's the price.
And
that's it.
Everyone that's tried to do this has come up with a number that's significantly different than the tuition. So Ben Nelson does this with Minerva. Ben Nelson started with a blank sheet of paper and said, here's what we're going to do, here's what we're going to charge students for, and it turns out to be less than $10,000.
I mean, the other issue that you didn't bring up is just debt and how we have really financed, especially the last 15 years of higher education, with a tremendous amount of debt, both institutional debt
and student debt.
But you know, the other thing, we rarely talk about the amount of debt that institutions have taken on in this last decade. Yeah.
So my intuition tells me that change is potentially likely to happen in segments. Okay? And a segment could be a group of like universities, say public universities or private universities or liberal arts colleges, or segments could be at undergrad or graduate, or could be domain-focused technology or humanities or something like that. To what degree do you think it's likely that the fastest changes are really going to be segment-driven? And to what degree are you already seeing that potential?
So I have a particular point of view on that. That's not widely shared, but I've been doing this in industry, academia, and government for a long time, and the idea comes from Buckminster Fuller. So you know, Buckminster Fuller's headstone in somewhere in Massachusetts, where he's buried, says, "Call me trim tab," and the word trim tab comes from Fuller's view of how large organizations change. The analogy he makes is that in order to turn a large ship at sea, the last thing you want to do is push against the bow of the ship. You know, you're going to break your engine and the ship isn't going to move at all. So the way you turn a large ship is you attach a small piece of metal to the rudder. You move that small piece of metal. It creates a region of low pressure. The ship is moving with great inertia in one direction, so that region of low pressure grows. It pulls the rudder and turns the ship. So the metaphor he's talking about is you don't change things in large organizations by taking, you know, the most hallowed institutions head on. You find small projects. You find things that create regions of low pressure that draw more people into it. And I mean, that's what we saw with MOOCs. You know, the transition from vilifying MOOCs at every chance you get to our program, to the University of Illinois programs, to all the programs that we're seeing start up around this idea, is people being drawn into a region of low pressure. So you know, it'll be interesting to see how you get those things going. We chose graduate because there was less resistance at the graduate level, but it could have very easily been at the undergraduate level that we did it too. But to do it in a way that gives you a tangible result that people can look at, they don't have to imagine what the world is going to be like, they can see what the world is going to be like, and they're drawn to those ideas.
Yep.
So my question, I think, is along the same lines as Jim's. I think I'll make a comment first and then I'll go to the question just in reaction, because in other circumstances, market forces cause change. If one organization can get to a pattern or a design, the rest are forced to follow. Now, there's some inherent boundary conditions to that for universities, because you can't quadruple the number of people, even with MOOCs. It's unclear exactly what the design is that allows you to force the other universities that are geographically dispersed to follow your model or to move to a different model.
Right.
Okay? So which So I'd love it to happen, but I can see that it's unlikely. The question then in my mind goes to the 200 or so agents of change or whatever, the people that you see that are making a difference. Is that critical mass, or is this going to take another 5 times that before the system begins to move? Or is it's already moving, that ship's turning, you just need to wait, and everybody's kind of going to wake up and we're pointing in another direction?
Yeah, so in my view of the world, the things that can stop it are icebergs that you don't anticipate, really dramatic economic shifts, really dramatic social upheaval. Those are the kinds of things that could stop it. I think to a large extent what we're seeing in higher education is driven by market forces. And it has to do, let me make a short preface for that. You have to understand that for a large portion of higher education, market forces play no role whatsoever. Harvard, Stanford could charge whatever they want for admission, for tuition, and they would have no problem filling up their freshman class. So it's the strange non-competitive market that exists in the bubble. The problem is that ripples through all of higher education. So that's an overlay to why the market forces are hard to see and hard to recognize. But the issue of college debt, this is the when I give talks like this in front of book clubs and bookstores, and there are civilians in the audience, it's all they want to talk about. It's
why
all
does
they want
college
to talk
cost so much, and why is it?
Yeah,
Why
and what you're seeing is that even in the declining market, fewer high school graduates choosing to go to college. Those who get into college choosing not to go, it's ultimately an economic decision that they're making. They don't see their path forward as being enhanced with this degree, and that's a market decision.
Questions over here? Yes, in the back. Well, you first, and then back.
I can ask a couple of questions. So one, do you have any data on the outcome of programs like the OMSCS? I know the first couple of classes of graduates have graduated, and I'm curious about like their success rate. That's one question, and if I may ask another question, do you see any alternative business models coming up in the education space that's not entirely reliant upon charging for admission or charging per semester, but there's other potential revenue ways of creating revenue?
Yeah. So both questions that lots of people are intensely interested in. So the OMSCS, understand we're only 2 years into it, so the data is really preliminary, but we do instrument these courses, and so we know, for example, what students are learning in the courses, and of course we see the demographic data, so we know how many students enroll, how many students drop out. For any metric you want to choose, the OMSCS students are performing at or better than the traditional program. We're not quite sure how to calculate things like retention rates, but when I look at the figures, I see retention rates among the OMSCS students that are 10 points higher than traditional students. Students seem to be happier. We certainly have online resources to gauge how students are satisfied. I mean, you get the surveys in these classes to say, so how happy are you with the instructor? How happy are you with the course? We see those in the offline and online space, and students are genuinely happy, and that's all pointing in the right direction. It'll take a couple more years before we know what the outcome is. I think the interesting thing for me in the data that we've seen so far is what it says about the market for higher education. So this program has expanded the market. My prediction was that we would steal master's students from other master's programs. Turned out to be wrong. What's happened is that this program has expanded the market for graduate education in computer science. That is, the students who are enrolling in our program are students who would have not normally had access to a master's degree, a high-quality master's degree in computer science. And in the first year, it was an 8% expansion. There's no reason to think that it's not going to level out around 10%, which means that over a 10-year period, we will have doubled the market for graduate education in computer science. Those numbers are just now being put together, but we're pretty happy with it. The new business models is a really interesting question. So right now we charge tuition. There's absolutely no reason that you couldn't have a subscription model in which you subscribe to Georgia Tech or UW or a university that gives you access to Netflix-style all-you-can-eat courses and degrees. That would really change the way we operated. It would change the finances. I'm a proponent of restructuring Title IV funding, so Pell Grant funding, to carve out a portion of government funds that cannot be used for tuition. It has to be used for things like advanced advising services. So specifically invest in the success of students that are getting Title IV funding. It takes that money out of the mix for universities, does severe damage to the business models for many, many universities. But it puts the focus on student success, not on contributing to bad management practices in the university.
We have until 2:30, right?
Right.
Or 2:30? Okay. So we'll make this the last question then. Go ahead.
A lot of the work that has been done in MOOCs so far is pretty much we've taken the sermon style lessons and put them online, and you watch the sermons online. But like, how far are we willing to go with reinventing this lesson and education format itself? Like, how are we willing to go to like one-on-one lessons, dynamic adaptive lessons where the system figures out what's gonna change, and like taking maybe a Project Euler style approach across all fields like biology, art, music, computer science, where you're learning in lessons and the system is learning about who's learning and then changing the whole system accordingly.
Exactly.
I say this as someone, like I just graduated college in December, and there are a lot of students there who are actively thinking about this and want to change it. So like,
I have to tell you that we do not just videotape lectures. Every course that we offer in MOOC format is a purpose-designed course that implements some kind of mastery learning principle. And so the whole idea is that you have to, if lectures are a really bad way to learn, then lectures videotaped are an even worse way to learn. So we don't make that mistake. But I think you're right. If you look at the portfolio of MOOCs that are out there, you find some very bad ones and some very very good ones. I think it's moving very quickly through higher education. The people in the humanities that 2 years ago used to have my scalp for talking about this stuff are now knocking on our door wanting to do English composition. We're doing English for non-English speaking students by calling it How to Write Business Emails in English, and it draws students in. And of course, it's a traditional English composition course. It's a traditional liberal arts course. So I think things will sweep through that part of higher. There'll be pockets of resistance, like in any revolution, but you stomp those out later on.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us, everybody, and please join me in thanking Rich for writing this great book.
Jeff, likewise.
Thank you.